first time in my career I've come out to the Backstreet Boys, but if I have anything to say about it, it's not going to be the last time. I just want to thank the organizers, U.S.-Mexico Foundation. These have been fantastic conversations so far. The one thing they've been missing, though, are PowerPoint slides, and so I'm here to get us back on track. We're going to have some data, we're going to have some slides. Everybody's going to feel a little more comfortable as this conversation gets going. There's not too many of them, though, so please do bear with me. As stated, I'm from Gallup. For those who don't know, Gallup is a research organization based in the US. And we do studies all over the world. Most of the data I'm going to talk about today is from the Gallup World Poll. This is a global research vehicle we launched 20 years ago. So we now have some really interesting trend lines. We cover at least 140 countries per year. That's 98% of the global population. And are doing these interviews in many cases, in about 100 of these countries, going face-to-face, doing them the hard way, knocking on people's doors, making sure that we're really covering every corner of the country, that everyone's voices are represented in forums and events like these. So I like to think that while we've got a lot of great leaders in the room, we're missing about 500 million or so residents of North America. And so hopefully this is one small part of bringing their voices into that conversation. I'm going to jump right into the data here. We're going to walk through a lot of these slides. There's a lot of data points, so bear with me. I'm going to try and go quickly. But I wanted to start off with this first measure, which is well-being. These are the first questions we ask on every global survey that we do. We ask people to evaluate their lives today and to think about their lives 5 years from now, where they expect to be. We take their answers to those two questions and we put them together and we classify them as either thriving, struggling, or suffering, depending on where their scores land. What you're seeing here is the percentage thriving across the three countries that we're talking about today. Overall, relatively similar scores here. Canada is lagging a little bit behind in this perceived rate of thriving, and actually has really seen a pretty steady decline over the last 10 years or so. It was a really interesting finding for me as somebody who, before I started looking at this data, really had a lot of sort of US opinions of Canada, like, well, they're doing all the social safety nets and things there differently. We've already heard some comments, and I'm really interested to hear more over this conversation about what is going on in Canadians' lives that's leading to this shifting perception. US and Mexico, a little bit of a different story. The US has also seen some declines over time, a little bit of an uptick in the last couple of years. Mexico, a little more volatile in the trend line, but at the moment, really neck and neck with the US in terms of that overall measure. Now, the overall measure is great, but we really want to get into what explains this data. The first thing is, of course, economic conditions. There's an old famous quote from US politics, it's the economy's stupid. It's still the economy. It really is economic conditions that underlie a lot of voters' behavior, a lot of consumers' behavior, and a lot of people's perceptions about how their lives are going. Across these metrics, Mexico really stands out to me among the three countries. And in these charts here, we're just looking from 2020, so looking from the COVID pandemic, which we know was this massive economic disruption on a global scale, and really trying to think about how have these economies changed in the years since then. The first two charts that you see here, these are asking people's perceptions of really local economic conditions. So asking about their local economy, do they think it's getting better or worse? Asking about their personal standard of living, do they think it's getting better or worse? In both of those cases, Mexico has seen this really significant growth over time, and at least in their momentum, really stands ahead of the US and of Canada. Canada, on the other hand, I talked about the decline in thriving we've seen over time. We've also seen some pretty steady declines in perceptions of the local economy, perceptions of standard of living. The other thing we know matters a whole lot, and a lot of organizations here are really focused on, are jobs and job creation. So we ask people around the world whether or not they think it's a good time to find a job in the area where they live. You'll notice here all three countries, really dramatic effect coming out of COVID. We knew the lockdowns, all of the immediate impacts on the economy led to really significant layoffs, a lot of disruptions to people's lives. It's no surprise to see that in 2021, 2022, hiring really surged across all three economies. But again, In the case of Canada, we've seen this has really fallen off pretty quickly. That surge has not been sustained. Same pattern at a basic level in Mexico and the United States, though I will point out again that Mexico has seen less of a decline, more of a steady hold here. And at the moment, Mexico and the US are tied in our data for this economic variable. Diving in a little bit into the US, Gallup is a US organization. We've got a whole lot of survey data in the US. These actually come from monthly polls that we do called the Gallup Poll Social Series. This is like the Gallup poll going back to the 1930s. On the left-hand side, you have US economic confidence. This is a measure asking people about how the economy is doing today in the area where they live, and then also combining that with a sense of are economic conditions getting better or worse. I won't go all into the index calculation here, but higher is better, lower is worse. This tracks really closely for those who pay attention to things like the University of Michigan Consumer Confidence Index. The correlation is like a 0.9 between these two measures. If anything, our measure has actually been a little more pessimistic in recent years as compared to the Consumer Confidence Index, perhaps a suggestion of some of the economic narratives that really played up really strongly in the last US election. What concerns me about this pattern, there's really two things here, and one is getting to the chart on the right-hand side, but the first is that pre-COVID, overall economic conditions for American citizens were generally favorable. We saw volatility, but above that zero line there that you see on the chart. At this point, we haven't seen a full recovery in economic confidence in the years following COVID. Some of the other conversations here have already touched on some of the potential economic risks on the horizon, the headwinds, there's technological issues, there's trade issues, there's diplomacy issues that are at play here. As someone who watches this data, I'm concerned for the American economy that they haven't recovered to that same level, and if the US is to experience a shock at this point, that could really lead to some very, very negative sentiments on the economy. The other one on the right-hand side, I'm not going to talk too much about politics today. I will touch on it a little bit. But what you have here is a question we asked earlier this year, and I just think it's emblematic, even though the data is a few months old at this point, of how Republicans and Democrats feel about the US economic prospects. So this is in April, relatively recently after a new administration, of course, a lot of disruption happening at that time. Republicans, 82% believed that the United States economy will be really growing quickly a year from now. So this is their projections for the start of Q2 of next year. Democrats on the other side, the vast majority thought the US economy was headed for either a recession or depression. Now, we're Gallup, we don't have political opinions, but I can tell you that both can't be right. And watching the coming months is going to be really interesting to see what actually plays out here. But the phenomenon we're seeing is that there is this incredible bias, according to people's political beliefs, in how they're interpreting these very basic sorts of things like economic conditions. This is, I apologize, this is the most complicated chart I'm going to show. It's going to get easier from here. This is looking another deep dive into these economic conditions. So we're asking here about people's feelings of their household income. So we asked them, how would you describe your household income today? And we've got a few response options. The best response option is living comfortably. So what you're seeing here is the percentage of people who say they're living comfortably. And then on each of the charts, as you go from left to right, we're looking at what their actual income is relative to others within the economy. So those on the far left-hand side, those are the folks who are in the bottom quintile, the poorest 20% within each country. The far right side are the richest 20%, those who are making more money than 80% of their peers in the economy. The thing that jumps out at me here, there's a lot on this slide, but a couple of things that stand out. First of all, the United States is a great place to be rich and not a great place to be poor. What you see in the US pattern is really a chart that is sort of emblematic of income inequality. How much money you make is a very strong determinant of whether or not you're living comfortably in the United States. Canada has a similar effect. It's slightly less pronounced. And in the case of Mexico, then, this is a really interesting finding because in Mexico, two things that stand out. First, we don't see the same really significant increase. Mexicans in the richest 20% are still feeling some challenges in their personal income. They're not saying that they're living comfortably. They're saying that they may be struggling to get by or they're finding it harder to get by. We also don't see a clear pattern in this distribution. And what stands out to me is that really for the middle class in Mexico. What does this mean for those who have an education, who are working, and are really still struggling to get by? That delivering on that promise is a big challenge. The last thing I wanted to point out is just, of course, this is 2025 data on the bars here. The gray line is what we saw in 2024. And so earlier this year, I was with some folks chatting about this data, and we've seen this distribution shift some. What stands out are a couple of things. One is, so if the bar is below the line, that means it's gotten harder for people in that income bracket. If the bar is above the line, it's gotten better. What stands out is the US and Canada, those at the top end, things are getting better. Those at the bottom end are not seeing those same kinds of gains. Again, this is an inequality sort of in perceptions. That's something that we should watch out for. Moving away from the economy, the next domain I wanted to get into is more of like people's confidence in institutions, what they're experiencing at home. This is another one where Mexico does stand out. I am really encouraged by some of the prior session's comments related to gains in security that Mexico has experienced. But over time, generally, when we ask Mexicans how they feel about safety, do you feel safe walking alone at night in the city or area where you live, and do you have confidence in your local police, really almost a phase shift away from what the experience in the United States and Canada looks like. This is a pattern, by the way, that holds across a lot of Latin America. Crime is an issue that Latin America, a lot of countries are struggling with, and we've seen, of course, really dramatic policy shifts in places like El Salvador and others recently, really trying to address issues related to criminality. I will make one point here on this before everybody thinks the US and Canada have everything figured out on safety, is the United States still has something that a lot of rich countries, a lot of relatively peaceful economies are experiencing, which is a really large gap between men and women on these perceptions. The US actually ranks 10th in the world for the size of the gap between men and women on their feelings of safety walking alone at night. 5 of the other top 10 countries are EU countries. So getting that basic security figured out is not the end of the story when it comes to perceptions of safety. The other slide, though, this is a little bit of a good news story, a comeback. I'm beating up on the Mexican data for a moment here. But when we ask people about their satisfaction with personal freedoms, Mexico has seen this really profound climb in satisfaction of personal freedoms over the time that we've been tracking this. 88% of Mexicans are satisfied with their personal freedoms in 2025. This is data from just like 2 months ago that we collected here in Mexico. The other thing that stands out is the country that's seen a drop on this measure is the United States. So the home of the free is now 3rd place in North America for personal freedoms. That's obviously for the Americans in the room not where they want to be, but something definitely to watch over time here. A couple of other institutions that we look at, so the judicial system, national government, and confidence in elections. Again, I don't have time to get into all of the nuances of what we're seeing on the slides here. I just wanted to call out sort of a couple of general patterns. First, both the US and Canada have seen this decline in trust in institutions like the national government and the judiciary over time. This is something we see reflected across other OECD countries. There's really a global crisis in institutional confidence going on. We can get into the specifics of why the US courts are particularly strained right now. For instance, Mexico, I think it's also interesting that we've seen an increase in judicial confidence recently. Of course, there's been some really profound changes in the Mexican judicial system of late. That's going to be a number that we're going to want to watch over time as well. Mexico also stands out for a real surge in confidence in the national government, and I think it's really interesting to watch how President Sheinbaum's policies and continuing her predecessor's policies, what that means for long-term confidence in national government for Mexicans. Canada stands out on honesty of elections. The really strong 7 out of 10 believe that elections are honest in Canada. Not the case for either the US or Mexico. Of course, we could also talk at length after this session about why that may be. Shifting away from domestic issues, the last topic I wanted to touch on here are views of foreign leadership. And so on this slide, we're just looking at Canada and Mexico. On the left-hand side is whether or not they approve of US leadership. This is a trend going back to 2008 when we first started asking this question. One thing is going to really stand out if you're paying attention to the x-axis here. There's a very strong political administration effect in how perceptions of Canadians and Mexicans towards United States leadership. That pattern holds for other countries around the world as well. The Trump administration was quite unpopular outside of the US. We've seen a return to those levels of popularity. Open question of whether or not that's the metric that the Trump administration is interested in, but the numbers don't lie. The other thing that's interesting, though, is that the Biden administration did not see the same levels of popularity as Obama. And so when we look at this data, we have these real questions about long-term shifts in confidence, how this data looks across different regions around the world. It's pretty interesting to follow. The other side of this, of course, is China, the most massive country, the growing competitor for the United States, and a country that the United States often frames themselves as being in direct competition with. For both Canada and Mexico, China's leadership approval rates have been ticking up in recent years. This is by no means overwhelming support. We're still talking about 2/3 or 3/4 who disapprove of Chinese leadership, but the trend is moving in a positive direction. And as of today, if we were to say, are these countries more favorable towards US leadership or Chinese leadership, China would be the winner in both cases, which is a really interesting development. My last slide here, I mentioned some of the partisan questions. I do think it's important to take a look from the other perspective as well. These are questions we just asked actually last month of Americans in our nightly poll, asking how they felt about the current relationship between the US and Canada and the current relationship between the US and Mexico. The overall takeaway is almost no one in America thinks these relationships are excellent. That's something everybody in this room should be working to change. But there is also a pretty notable political party preference here. Republicans are more likely to think that these relationships are good or at least fair. Democrats more likely to think that the current state of the relationships are poor.
The first thing I would say is that you say you are not going to talk about politics. I'm sorry, it's the only thing we're going to talk about, right?
All right.
Because it's the only thing that we care about. So I think I see Yvette there saying yes. So we'll get into that. First, let me ask you a question for comparison. You say all of the countries about 55% on driving. How do you compare that to the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, North America is sort of in the middle overall. When we look at countries with the highest rates of thriving, they're those damn Nordic countries. Finland is always the happiest country on earth. 90% of people or more will be classified as thriving based on how they're really rating their lives. The other end of the spectrum, and this is strong external validity for the measure, I would say, is are conflict zones. Some countries in sub-Saharan Africa that really struggle. A couple years ago, right after the Taliban took control in Afghanistan, we actually had 0% of the Afghan population classified as thriving. We've never seen that anywhere else. But so that 50% is sort of middle ground.
In China.
How's China doing? China's doing better on these measures. We've seen real growth in China, real growth in other Asian countries. The part of the world actually that's seen the most growth are former Soviet states. Eastern Europe, we've seen really, since we've tracked it, dramatic shifts in people thriving over time as those economies have become one with the world.
And does that have a lot to do with the relative thriving, that is where they were before and where they feel they are today?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point about this measure. It's one of the reasons we like this measure, as opposed to metrics like GDP, which are always going to come down to the math, and countries with really powerful economies are going to win out, is because what is this life about, right? We can get very philosophical here very quickly, but at the end of the day, how people feel about their lives and whether or not they have hope and optimism for the future, that's what governments, we think, should be paying attention to, and what we think local communities should be focused on as well.
Okay. Let me ask you specifically about the U.S. And the truth for my question is that we believe that this mess we're in terms of USMCA and negotiation and trade among the three countries has a lot to do with the United States, right? I don't think this is something that Mexico or Canada started. I think it's something that Mexico and Canada probably are responsible for, because we didn't do much about it, and that's to Rob's point. But what are the differences that you see on these perceptions on the different regions in the U.S. or the different demographics in the U.S.? Before, in the last North Capital Forum in Washington, you talked about the Hispanics in the U.S. being the most optimistic and probably believing that they are thriving. So where do you see the difference both in demographics and the regional areas of the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's sort of three things that stand out to me when we look at U.S. views of anyone outside of the U.S. First, and this is, we didn't talk about this last time, is the U.S. and many Americans have if you're being generous, you could call it a luxury. You might choose a different word. Otherwise, of being pretty ignorant about what's going on outside of the United States. Okay. We actually I had questions on U.S. approval of Mexican leadership and Canadian leadership that we asked Americans. And the most common answer was don't know. That they just really didn't have an opinion. So I think that's one important thing to have out there. One of the reasons why that's important is because the other two variables that really come to play, one is definitely political affiliation. And so this issue of if I perceive the administration's policies as being things that I identify with, then in general, I'm going to think whatever they're doing is favorable. There is a strong geographic component to this in the U.S., of course. We talk about swing states in American elections, and I live in Nebraska. There's a little blue dot where I get to vote, but the rest of the state is pure red, and no one thinks that state is really going to be contested at any point.
Okay, I was surprised at one of your graphs, and we talked a little bit about this, I would have thought that when we talk about the relevance of Mexico and Canada, that Republicans would be actually lower. So why are they high now? Is that because Trump is dealing with Mexico and Canada on a way that they believe is relevant, or because they believe that the relationship is actually important? Because it is probably one of the graphs, there's another one, but that stands out the most to me.
Yeah, I think you're...
Because I don't feel that they're treating us like we are very important. Huh? It's just that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, well, we didn't ask what they thought the relationship should be. Okay. We just asked if they thought it was good or not, the way it is right now. And so I do think your first supposition is that Republicans, by and large, are generally looking at this and saying Trump is managing this relationship, Trump's putting tariffs in place, renegotiating these agreements, making a lot of bold statements, and that's what we want, that's what the relationship should look like. Whereas Democrats on the other side are saying, oh my God, what happened to USAID and all of these organizations, international diplomacy, and so they think all these relationships are shot.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's what I thought it was. Because that means that part of the population, what they want is what's happening right now. And a lot of us here, I don't see anybody now, not because of the light, but it's dark, but we know that what we want is integration. So let me go to, how do we manage that? How do we... Enrique and I have talked about this for a long time, is how do we change people's perspective on the positive side of the relationship, and how quickly do perceptions actually change?
Yeah, there's a lot there. But let me take that last piece first, is in terms of how quickly perceptions change, there are some indicators, and we could get really wonky on this one if we wanted to, and I don't think we necessarily want to. Maybe we do. There are some indicators that are very, very volatile. They're very sensitive to what's going on in the outside world. Things that are tied to politics are one of those examples. So in the U.S., when we see an administration change, I think the most dramatic example I've seen is in 2008, when we went from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. All of a sudden, Republicans and Democrats flipped places on whether or not they had confidence in the U.S. military. Now, nothing had changed with the U.S. military from 2007 to 2008, right? Exactly the same military that was there, but because of that identification, that opinion did switch really quickly. So in these transition moments, I take some of these changes with a grain of salt, and I'm more focused on, especially when it comes to these economic variables, what does the next year hold? What are we going to see as policies start to have an impact, as employment starts to change, as we see that trade policies are really starting to disrupt trade flows, for instance? What does that mean for inflation? What does that mean for employment? Because there are actual lived experiences that are underneath these beliefs that at the end of the day is what for swing voters, for those who are open to making up their mind based on what they're seeing in the world, it's the line about the economy that I said earlier, is that really at the end of the day, if they're having a hard time paying for things, and this is something that they're experiencing over an extended period of time, that's a big challenge. I would say really quickly on the other side, that the security example, again, that was talked about earlier, declining homicide rates, that's fantastic news. But that takes time for people to experience that, because something like fear, and if you've been leaving your house for years and you feel unsafe when you're leaving your house, it's not just something that overnight is going to go away. It really does take time for that change to happen.
Thanks. Another graph that stood out to me. You see economic confidence going up, but then difficulty to find a job dramatically going down. How do these two perceptions actually exist in the same environment?
Well, I actually think you've made a good point of what we were just talking about, is that difficulty to find a job metric is more of a leading indicator, I would say.
Okay.
That people are looking and they're saying, gosh, I heard about a friend and they're on the labor market and they can't even get an interview and they've got credentials and they've been out there for a long time. And they start to realize that there are real challenges. Then they hear about companies laying off. They pay attention to the jobs reports. They hear these numbers. Economic confidence is based on what their experiences are at the end of the day. And so in the US, for instance, it's going to be really interesting watching the coming labor reports because things like federal workers have remained on US payrolls through last week in many cases and are just now being counted among unemployment statistics. People who have been continuing to get severances from these sorts of organizations, they haven't necessarily felt those economic impacts yet. So I do think that's one part of it. The other thing I would say is that economic conditions index, it is in negative territory. So it's coming up, but it's coming up from a pretty low number, and it hasn't yet gotten to where we would really say people feel like the economy is doing great.
Because the graph going down on difficulty to find a job, it's already 2024 and 2025. So it's not like a new number, but your expectation would be that would impact then the economic confidence metric.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if that perception of difficulty to find a job becomes more and more real because there are actual labor shifts. That's the big concern.
Now, let me get to polarization, because when we look at the graphs, how do we trust average data, right? Because, you have this saying that averages are evil, and because they are not telling you the full story. And first of all, has polarization always been this problem, and how does Gallup deal with it? And how do we make decisions with such a polarized environment?
It's a huge challenge. I haven't heard that averages are evil, but I might steal that line. I'm going to start using that. It's one of the reasons I wanted to show a lot of different metrics is because at the end of the day, you can't look at any single number and make a decision off of that. You have to think about what am I hearing from different people? What are their demographics? What do I know about them? In terms of what we've seen, Gallup on polarization, I would say it has absolutely gotten worse. I think there's strong data to support that. Yes, the U.S. has been polarized for a long time. Everybody can think back. There hasn't been any amicable political campaign in the United States, really, right? I mean, the sides always dislike each other. The thing that's changed is the politicization of institutions that used to be above the fray. And so the judiciary, for instance, is one that really stands out. That I mentioned the military as another example, where when people's perceptions of these apolitical institutions are being tied to their political identity in stronger and stronger ways, we really see that, and it's a real concern. I think the other thing that we haven't talked about yet is, and maybe back to one of your earlier questions, is how do you communicate? Is the Americans and around the world, this trend is there. Americans are really noteworthy for it. Do not trust the media. This is no matter who you are. The trust in the media has just completely collapsed over time. And I think a big part of this is what we see with echo chambers, what we see with people rewarding their own biases and the kinds of sources they get, and that it seems the media in general maybe spends half their time just pointing out why the other side of the media is wrong instead of reporting on the issues. But that is definitely a growing pattern.
On polarization, and I have this stress of this clock that Enrique has here, so
we have so much time.
We got to speed up, but no. The lack of trust of institutions, both on the US, Mexico, and Canada. I was surprised also to see the judiciary system, where it's very polarized, the opinion in Mexico. A lot of people believe that the change that we did maybe doesn't take us in the right direction. But again, when I look at the numbers, how were we going to expect that the politicians didn't want to change something that has such a negative opinion, right? So how do we build institutions on an environment with so little confidence on institutions?
Yeah.
And I think that for the North American way, it's a super challenging effort.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. And what I talked about earlier with the confidence has declined in some cases to points where we're building from scratch with rebuilding trust in institutions. The big thing that stands out to us, and we've looked at this data not just in North America, but across all of the countries where we're able to ask these questions, and done some analysis of what really predicts this if you control for some of these other variables. So if we say, let's actually control for political party affiliation, let's control for whether or not you approve of your national leader, which is a good proxy in places where we don't ask about political parties. We don't ask that in every country in the world. And when you do that, the people who have confidence in national institutions, they report positive experiences with local service delivery. That's
Okay.
really the key underneath this. And so when we think about how do you rebuild trust in institutions, it's got to come down to people saying, actually, the schools that my kids go to are pretty great. Actually, I do get good health care. You know, the basics are being met. The confidence in police example earlier, that's a really important indicator. If people have confidence in their local police, they feel safe, they have, but what does confidence look like? It's not just, you know, we think that the police is tough and can fight crime. It's, I know the local policemen. I know these people, I see them in the community, I'm able to interact with them. And if we see that people have confidence in those local experiences of public service delivery, they're much more likely to have confidence in the national government, in the judicial system, in these external institutions as well. It's not just national government. We've looked at this in NATO countries. People's opinions of international institutions and multilateral efforts are also affected by that experience at home. If you trust the government to deliver for you, then you're going to also trust what the government is saying and doing when it maybe doesn't affect your daily life in the same way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Today we had the board meeting of the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, and one of the critical activities that we believe we have to focus is on the grassroots, let me say, going local to Texas, to California, to Nebraska, to talk about the positive things of trade. Two more questions before the clock runs out. One is I'm curious to know what's the perception of China in the world. Because we continue to think that this is one of the things that we have to deal with U.S. It's saying we are the last battleground, let me say, of the continent, Canada and Mexico, that it's actually your number one trading partner. The rest of the world tends to be a trading partner with China first.
Yeah.
What's the opinion of the rest of the world of China?
That's one of the most interesting topics that I personally look at is this idea of, we talk about relative soft power. So are people leaning towards the United States or leaning towards China more? China's story over the years that we've been tracking it is really interesting. I mentioned earlier that U.S. not having opinions of Canadian leadership necessarily. When before, if we go 10 years ago or so, the modal response around the world, it's a nerdy stats term, but the most common response that people would give in many countries about Chinese leadership is they didn't know. They didn't have a perception of Chinese leadership. That changed really dramatically in 2020, when all of a sudden, for a lot of people around the world who hadn't necessarily thought about China, there was this incredibly negative experience associated with China, rightly or wrongly, which was COVID. All of a sudden, China was in the news, and we saw that people's opinions we saw that don't know category really fell away, and most people moved into the disapprove category at that moment in time. Now, what's happened since then is also really interesting, and it's really interesting also for those who pay attention to the way China positions and messages on the global stage, and forums like the UN a couple of weeks ago, is that countries where China has strong economic relationships, we do see an impact of people are starting to have a more favorable opinion towards China. There are countries that are more contested. So the South China Sea countries, for instance, are very skeptical of Chinese behavior and intentions. Chinese messaging on the global stage, though, right now, and this is, I think, one of the most significant geopolitical topics right now, is whether or not U.S. policy is the correct choice remains to be seen in many ways. But China has absolutely and explicitly seized this moment to start messaging that they are going to be positive actors on the environment, they're going to be positive actors on economic conditions, that they're going to look to develop and support countries that the U.S. has said that they are not going to be investing in the same ways. And so these next few years, I think is going to be really fascinating to, at the end of this, do we see that in the eyes of the world, is China really seen as an equal partner to what the U.S. historically has been really since the end of World War II?
That's super interesting because in a lot of the conversations, certainly China is in the center, where I was talking to Carlo, for example, on infrastructure and the way China has looked at developing infrastructure. And now the soft power of trade, which again in the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, we've always said trade is more relevant than just the goods and services that are going back and forth. It's the relationships that are built with that. So I do think that in the region, we need to start thinking about many of these things. And how do we go to the next phase of integration? Because I truly believe it's the most positive outcome for our communities. But I think there is a lot of homework. And I'd like to close with you sharing with us the diplomacy definition that you gave me, because, again, we're talking about public diplomacy all day today, tomorrow, and Tuesday. And I think it was really good.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'd love to share. And I think a lot of our conversation, and really all of the conversations that are happening here, kind of touch on this fundamental point. And I was in a session a couple weeks ago at the UN. It was Chatham House Rules, so I won't tell you which diplomat, but a noteworthy diplomat said that diplomacy is all about finding the smallest piece of common ground, standing on that ground together, and building from there. And I think when we talk about how do we shift the narrative, how do we shift the perception in Americans' minds and Mexicans and Canadians' minds about this relationship, it's finding what are those true common lines and then working to build from it. And I think events like this are a great example of where that conversation starts.
Thank you so much. What leaves me, again, optimistic, using Antonio comments today, is that I don't think we have just a few things of common ground that are positive in the region. I think we have a lot of things of common ground in the region. I think let's all continue to try to build on it, but really learn what the current environment is. And I think this is one mistake that we can make. To try to rebuild the NAFTA era, I think it's impossible. I think we need to build a new era. Again, Rob, you talked a lot about this today. So, but I am sure that by working together, we're going to be able to build that fantastic new era for North America. Thank you for sharing so much data with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right.